Tonight I hope you have your Bible with you, because I want to bring you a message out of a book that is called Habakkuk. And when you mention Habakkuk, you'll get about 12 different interpretations, or I've heard it called everything. I call it Habakkuk. And so what I'd like for you to consider is this little book, the first chapter, because I've been reading lately a lot in the minor prophets. And I think it's important that we do read the minor prophets because they have a lot to say. You say, well, one man told me, he said, I never read the minor prophets. That's all concerning Israel. But you'll find that what concerns Israel, especially the northern kingdom and Judah, but basically the northern kingdom, fits so well with the world you and I are living in today. It fits with the problems that we are encountering, but folks just don't seem to pay much attention to them. But this book's a little hard for the average Christian to find, but if it's third over from Jonah and 5 back from Malachi. So if you can't find it, just count them off as you get to it, because I just want to speak to you a little bit out of the first chapter. This book is often ignored. I think part of it's because its name is so hard to get the idea, Habakkuk. And I've heard it pronounced about 25 different ways in my life, and many of them by preachers. But we find that he was a prophet. He was a prophet, but he was also a singer in the temple choir in Jerusalem. Not in Jerusalem, but in Judah, in Jerusalem. And he was there under the reign of Josiah. Josiah was the last good king that Israel had, the Judah, and he was a man that had 3 sons. And when Josiah went over to defend Syria, of all places, he went to defend Syria against the Egyptians and was killed there. And then his sons were placed by the Egyptians, Joahaz, Jehoiakim, and Jehoiachin, and all of his grandsons, Zedekiah. They were all that was left to rule this kingdom with his death. So it's well known that the Babylonian army that overran finally Jerusalem and destroyed them, it is pronounced to us basically in Habakkuk as an army of the Chaldeans. Now we know the Chaldean armies have been around for a long time. They were actually the recruited army of the Babylonian hordes. They fought also in the Battle of Jerusalem, according to a history book I ran across one time in my reading. But it is well known that the Babylonian army was composed of many of these Chaldeans, for they were key fighters. That was their purpose in life, to fight and to be in the armies of the Chaldeans and of the Babylonian kings. And so the people are not, until the Assyrians founded, they dwelt in a wilderness. They were given a land over in west of Arabia, and there they formed a family, and then finally they were moved to the other side of the river. Forgot the name of the river, but anyway, it's the one that Babylon is on, and were given a place close to the east coast. But you know, this was where their land was, but they were basically a warlike people. That was what they were trained for. In other words, the life of the Chaldeans, in other words, if you had a child with a Chaldean wife, you would find that he would automatically be drafted into the armies of the Babylonians. And so what we find is that this people was not till the Assyrians founded it and made it of their armies, and they participated strongly in the battle for Jerusalem. But I want us to look at the first chapter, because I think the first chapter of the book of Habakkuk is very pertinent to what's going on in our world today. most all the minor prophets fit well with what's going on. You say, well, these are old books. This was the old life. It was the Chaldeans. It was back to do with the northern kingdom, or is back with Judah. But it fits so perfectly to what we contend with. Now Habakkuk wrote, as he said, during the reigns of this king and his sons and his grandson, and then Jerusalem fell in things. So here Habakkuk wrote this in chapter 1. The burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. In other words, he said it's a burden. He did see it. In other words, he said, this is hard for me to prophesy, because it wasn't a good prophecy. It was a bad prophecy, because it was the wrath of the Chaldeans that was about to fall upon the city of Jerusalem. And here he says, and the burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see, O Lord, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out of thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Now here's this prophet, singer in the choirs of the temple, and he's then prophesying to this. And now he's talking to us about the condition that Israel came in and Jerusalem came into after the death of Uzziah, or the death of Josiah. And so he's talking about it. He said, "How long, Lord, shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear?" He's crying about the deteriorating conditions of his nation. He's crying about the lawlessness that had developed in Judah. He's talking about the idolatry that had come into Judah. He's talking about the falseness of the political parties that were in Judah. He's talking about everything that has to do with graft and corruption. He said, "O long, how, Lord, shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save." He no doubt was as many people of Israel or Judah. He was under problems too. He said, "I cry out unto thee of violence, and you won't deliver me out of them." You know, he's saying, I'm stuck here in Jerusalem. He said, and things are getting progressively worse with each one of these kings, these last 4 kings of Judah. He said, I'm here. He said, and thou wilt not save me. He was a godly man. He was a prophet of God. And he was asking God, with the condition that his nation had gotten into, he said, God, why don't you deliver me out of this? Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are they that raise up strife and contention. He was talking about the condition of Jerusalem just prior to its fall. You could read Jeremiah the prophet, you could read other places in the Bible and get the same description, but it struck me as this man was a holy man that sung in the choirs of God, and yet he was a prophet of God. He said, therefore the law is slacked. In other words, Judah had the law of God. He had the 10 Commandments, plus they had the books of Deuteronomy and such, all the books of the law that were available. But the law is slacked, and judgment doth never go forth. He said, my government doesn't judge correctly. He said, they are showing favoritism, and the wicked doth compass about the righteous. In other words, what he's saying is this: if the wicked have the upper hand in Jerusalem, in the tribe of Judah, they're the ones that have got the upper hand. Well, I think if you'll stop and consider, this is just about the situation we have now in the United States of America. The wicked seem to be getting the upper hand in everything. Look at our presidential election we've got going. First time I ever remember in our country that I didn't have anybody I could vote for. But the thing of it is the wickedness doth compass about the righteousness, and therefore wrong judgment proceeded. He said the wicked are having their way, and the righteous can't seem to do anything about it. There was no recourse to the judges and the priests of the land at all. They weren't interested in the fall and the condition of the people. He said, and behold ye among the heathen, and regard, and wonder marvelously. Now he's starting to change his theme. He said, behold ye among the heathen, and regard, and wonder marvelously. Here's what he said. God said, for I will work a work in your days, which you will not believe, though it be told you. He said, God is going to do something about this situation. You won't believe it, even though I tell you you won't. What's going to happen? You won't believe me because you can't comprehend the wrath that God is going to pour out on the city of Jerusalem and the tribe of Judea in turn. Here's what he says. For lo, I will raise up the Chaldeans. This is the people of the Babylonian armies. This was a part of the Babylonian army that came under Nebuchadnezzar. It was part of his forces that came on the first siege and the second siege as far as Jerusalem was concerned. He said, I'll raise up the Chaldeans. And then he begins to tell us about the Chaldeans that he's going to raise up. That bitter and hasty nation which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not there. Now, you say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with us now, does it? I think it does, because I think this is a very description of the Chaldeans, and it's the same condition we see with the armies of the ISIS. They have no authority over them unless it be Muhammad the prophet or Allah the God, and they're just tramping through all the land. And so they constantly are trying to do it. God said, I'll raise up the Chaldeans, and this was the hand of God that said, I'll raise them up. You know, we sometimes don't really think that God will allow something that evil or something to happen. But here to his chosen people, they had gone their route, they had turned their back, they were a lawless nation, they did not respect the law, their prophets lied and cheated and stole. We know the stories of Jeremiah and those other prophets, when they said, it was God's doing, I'll raise up the Chaldeans. Isaiah 10:5 and 6 says this concerning them, O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger, and the staff in your hand is mine indignation. He said, this people, these that I'm going to raise up against Jerusalem, God says this, O Assyrian, the rod of mine anger. In other words, we sometimes think, well, God wouldn't use somebody like that. I remember he used Adolf Hitler, evil as he was and as murderous as he was, but he was used, and it said, and the staff is in their hand is mine indignation. God said, how many times have I warned Jerusalem? How many times have I called for Jerusalem to repent of all their falseness and all their lies and all their governments and things? With Josiah, he tried to do that. But Josiah's changing about the cities of God. He tore up the places, the groves and everything. But it was not complete. He wasn't able to change the people. And his sons that he had, his 3 sons, each one of them got progressively worse as far as ignoring Almighty God. He said, I will send him in against an hypocritical nation. That was Judah he was talking about. And so what he's saying is God said, I'm going to send him against some hypocrites. And that hypocrites was the nation of Israel, was Judah in particular, was Jerusalem for the primary city. I will send him, this is the Chaldeans, I will send him against the hypocritical nations, and against the people of my wrath will I give him a charge to take the spoil and to take the prey and tread them down like the mire of the streets. You know, it's hard for us to comprehend that God would do this to his own chosen people. But God's own chosen people had gotten so bad in Jerusalem, had gotten so bad they were ignoring everything that was right and righteous about God. And he said, I will give him charge to take the spoil, take the prey, and tread them down in the mire of the streets. his description with them was this: they were a bitter and a hasty nation. They were angry. That was their bent to exert their power. Until that time, they had no gods but the idols of the Mideast. They had the same gods that the Babylonians basically worshiped, but they did not even worship the Babylonian gods, and they had no gods of their own at this particular time. They simply were victims, or shall I say, recruits for the wars that the Babylonians decided to battle. They worship, and the people they described to God as bitter, discontented, angry against all around them. Our example today of such nations is North Korea. That's one nation we've got right now that fits well this description. They're mad at everybody, and they're giving arms to everybody. But he said that it's Asian countries such as China, Asiatic, and North Korea, and how about Central Asian countries such as Iran and Afghanistan? They're bitter and angry. They have no use for America, and they have absolute no use for the God of America, whatever is left of the God of America. But they are not worshipers. They're not Christians. They have no desire to worship in the Christian faith, because we find that the result is every time they capture a city, the first people to die in that city are the Christian people. So these followers of Muhammad, the first thing they'll do is clear them out, kill them in the most devious ways, put them in steel cages, put them in the water till they drowned, or put them in steel cages and build a fire under the steel cage. And all the defense that they have is that they name the name of Christ. Now I know that we're talking about the Christian settlements that are all through the Mideast. Now they're not Christians such as you and I are, but their foundation was Christian. They call themselves Christian. And you know, they're not afraid to stand against an enemy that they know will take their life and say that they're a Christian. So it says, which shall march through the breadth of the land. And that's exactly what ISIS is trying to do. Not only Israel, but all the lands surrounding Israel. They want the whole Middle East. And they're determined to restore what they call the caliphate. And their purpose and their acts of war is this: to kill, rape, murder, plunder, and loot seems to be the motive for the Chaldeans. There's no sympathy in their soldiers. There's no sympathy in their leadership. They simply are going to try to destroy what they can. Now this brings us up to date, because we have this ISIS, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to restore a caliphate. Now, for those of you who may not know what a caliphate is, a caliphate was when basically the ruler was a Mohammedan, and they actually ruled clear over in Hungary and Romania and Turkey, and incidentally Hitler tried to make a pact with them, with the Turks, but there, then all across the northern African continent, clear down and across the Straits of Gibraltar, and up into the middle of the city of Spain. And the sole purpose that they had was to conquer and to rape and to plunder. First war America got into was when, because they would take our sailors off our ship and our American passengers and make slaves out of them. So nobody else would do, Germany wouldn't do, nobody else would do, but America just went in and took one of their caliphate leaders, not their Turkish one, but he took one, and it says, and what they want to do is they travel through and they possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. This means they either kill or drive or from any of their homes and possessions and claim them for theirself. And Habakkuk said, the fierceness of them is resolved, and he talks about, and their horses also are swifter than leopards. They are more fierce than the evening wolves, and their horsemen shall spread, it means simply they shall grow fat with the conquering of what they conquer. In other words, they take anything they want to take. They have no respect for anybody, any power, any authority. We see that, don't we? And yet we haven't. God, as America, I think we need to rise up like we did on shores of what was the name of Tripoli, and just go in and start cleaning them out. But that's only my opinion. It simply means they will do as they want and commanded with no consideration of human life. And their horsemen shall come from afar. Now that's interesting. Their horsemen shall come from afar. They were not only the ISIS, they were not only the Chaldeans, but anybody that wanted to plunder and rape and murder and kill was welcome in their things. What do we have? We have a solution program in our country where we're trying to get our young girls and our young men to do what? Fly into Turkey and go down to the Turkish border and cross over into Syria. That's just where they basically are bad, and it's a consideration of human life. And the horsemen shall come from afar, and they shall fly as the eagle that hasteneth to eat. In other words, it fits perfectly what we have, flying them in and joining the army, young girls flying in and becoming consorts or wives, not wives I don't think, as far as it says to the success of God. But ISIS is Muslim and the Mideast, and it swells the ranks in warfare. Sounds like the Russia join ISIS, as they say, it's lawless. Now the motivation to conquer and kill. They come all for violence. Now I'm not quoting, I'm quoting what God says. Their whole purpose in being there is for violence. They want to take, rape, and kill whatever they want. They're come all for violence, and to gain others' wealth for themselves, and the violence by which they enlarge their border, says, and they sup up, which means to make for themselves all, or take for themselves all that belong to others. You know, we see them in our TVs. We see them with their big, huge tanks and their giant pieces of artillery. But you know, those giant tanks and the giant pieces of artillery, they're American. They have taken it from neighboring people. They have taken it from whoever has it. They have armed themselves. We have armed them, not intentionally perhaps, but because we didn't bring home all the things that they're using. They'll sup up as the east wind, God says. Well, the east wind that comes into the Holy Land at certain times of the year is direct and hard and constant. In other words, they come as the east wind, unstoppable in the direction and power this part of the world. Most severe weather is from the east, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand. In other words, they just capture them and kill them, or capture them and torture them. So here it is, the pride of the Chaldean. Habakkuk 1:10 says this, and they will scoff at the kings. That's what they did. Any king that stood up against them, any force that stood up against them, they scoffed at them. They scoffed at the kings and the princes, and they scorn unto them, and they shall deride every stronghold, for they shall heap dust and take it. In other words, they're conquering city and town after town. And until we determine that we're going to resist them, they'll continue to do so. You say, well, I don't hear much about them now. I said, well, we bomb them a little bit, but we haven't stopped them. Their advance is still there. They're making the first parts of their caliphate, and they intend that caliphate cover all of Turkey, over into Europe, over into Bosnia, about something. In other words, Romania and those places, I remember them better by the old names. But the thing of it is, Habakkuk 1:10a says, and they shall scoff, mock at the kings, and make the princes a laughing stock, and shall be a scorn unto them. They shall deride every stronghold, and they shall take it. You know, we in the paper and says so. Well, ISIS took such and such a place. They're willing to die in fighting to take such and such a place. We're not willing to send men the risk of their lives to stop them. So the change of the victors is this. Habakkuk 1:11 says, then shall his mind change. Now he's talking about the Chaldeans. In other words, they basically were just, shall we say, just living for rape, pillage, and sin. But then his mind change and imputing his power to his God. Well, he basically doesn't have a God. But he says here his mind shall change, and he faces the Chaldeans first worship their gods and their idols. Excuse me. But as their success expanded, it seems their God has changed from idol worship to the worship of the gods of materialism. Because they want the money, they want to take the wealth of the nations, they want to take all the equipment. Before that, God as describes, it seems that the prophet breaks into his account with the 3 verses to acclaim the greatness of his God. In other words, he's been talking all about this group, this Chaldeans. Habakkuk 1, 12, and 13 says this. The prophet says this, and art thou not from everlasting, O Lord, my God, mine Holy One? We shall not die, O Lord. Thou hast ordained them for judgment, and, O mighty God, thou hast established them for correction. What this prophet is saying is, God, I know you're going to deal with them. They did then, but they're not now. They're allowing them to have their own way. Thou art pure eyes, he says of God, than to behold evil, and canst not look on iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them? I gotta quit trying to figure out how to not cough into this microphone. He said, Thou art pure eyes than to behold evil, and cannot look upon iniquity. Wherefore lookest thou upon them that deal treacherously, and holdest thy tongue? When the wicked devoureth a man, it is more righteous than he. In other words, he said, they're doing what they want to do, and there's nobody really contending with them. You know, they're, as far as we're concerned, they're the JV, as our president said. But there's a God of the Chaldeans now. And here is where they to take a God for themselves. Habakkuk 1:14. He said, And thou makest the men as the fishes of the sea, and as the creeping things that have no ruler over them. They have no concept of Christianity or Christians. They just are something to be eliminated. There's no God conscious in these men. As fish, they're only fit only for consumption or to be used. They have no soul. That's what they're concerned about. They kill Christians, but they think they have no soul. They'll destroy a city, but they think the people that they destroy have absolutely no soul. 1:15 says, and they take up all of them with an angle. In other words, just like fishermen will take fish with an angle. They catch them in their net, and they gather them in their drag. Therefore they rejoice and are glad. They're happy in what they're doing. That's their life. That's what they geared themselves for. And we won't do nothing to stop a godless group of people. They celebrate their victory, pillage, murder, and lawlessness, which becomes the way of life. 1:16 and says, therefore they sacrifice unto their net. They didn't sacrifice unto their God. Their net has become their God, and burn incense unto their drag, because their portion is fat and they're great and their meat plenteous. In other words, they are getting out of the people what they want. They're taking their homes, they're taking their wealth, they're taking everything they have, and they're happy about it. Constant conquest, ill-gotten gain, rape, murder has become a way of life, and the wealth as personal gain. He said in Habakkuk 1:17, shall they therefore empty their net and not spare to continue to slay the nations? They do not intend to stop just because we said you need to stop. They intend to restore the caliphate. That is what they intend to do. And they're starting right where the first caliphate and where the first Chaldeans fought. They are right in the exact same area from which they came. So the conclusion is, it's hard to convince me that ISIS and their goals, their methods of murder and pillage, that are not the modern day version of the Chaldeans that we are faced with today. Habakkuk 3 says this, and I'm going to close with this. I got more I'd like to say, but I'll just close with this. I will stand, now this is the prophet speaking, I will stand upon my watch, and set me up on the tower, and I will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. And those prophet said, this ought not to be happening. God's not happy with me, or is he happy with my people, is what he's saying. He said, and the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, make it plain up on the tables, that he they may run that readeth it. Well, there's some question about that statement. In other words, it said make it big enough that he can run, or make it big enough that he can run and read it. You ever try to run anything, or try to read anything while you're running? You're not very successful at it. I might read a billboard or so, but he's saying here that make it plain. He said, make it plain that you can vision, and make it plain at the tables, that he that run may read it. It was only for the day of Habakkuk that this God so persistent on its preservation. Here he says that he may run that readeth it, implies the importance of carrying God's message forward. For the vision is yet for an appointed time. I know that when he prophesied, he was saying it was for an appointed time. He was talking about the fall of Jerusalem. He was talking about the carrying away of Judah into captivity. He was talking about that. I'm sure he was. But he's also, I think, talking about this. For an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come. It will not tarry. We're seeing it. We're seeing what Habakkuk had been warning Israel about. You say, well, that's old. But I stop and consider. The government of Israel in Habakkuk's day had no love for God. With each succeeding king of the 4 kings, starting with Josiah, who tried for revival, but everything I've read concerning him, it didn't really last long, and it wasn't very extensive. And if you remember, he was no friend of the prophet Jeremiah, because he was responsible for locking him up once, I believe, if I remember correctly. But his sons, each one of them ruled at the authority not of the people of Israel, but at the hand of the Pharaoh. They were appointed when Hosea lost his life in the battle for Syria. And so they each one ruled. And they came down. They were also the kings when these same ones came and did battle against the walls of Jerusalem, came and saw the toppling of the walls of Jerusalem. And he says, now, make it plain that he may run that readeth it. In other words, I've simply tried to say, this didn't sneak up on God. He was aware of it. He wrote it in a book. You say, well, that happened back then. Yeah, but the same thing is happening. Every one of the minor prophets that you'll read has its parallel in what is happening today in our world, in our nations, and in America. You can go ahead and read the next 2 chapters if you'd like. I wasn't sure I could preach through that myself tonight, but it's certainly that we are in a world, and the world we're living in is following the same pathway that we're seeing here. You say, well, Jerusalem's still standing. Do you think it will? God will protect Jerusalem, yes. But there'll be a time when Jesus comes and takes us out, and Jerusalem will fall. Because Jerusalem, they'll build a new temple there, and a temple not for God, but for the Antichrist will be built there. Everything that is hinging in the minor prophets, you'll find, is taking place. Read through the other minor prophets and see what you find in your reading through them that you see happening in America today. All right, let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed.